here in the stateroom of the White House of the United States of America, because you're just that important, right? You're just that important. And this is the best part of the day. Every time we do these, it's today. So thank you for being here. I was a budding writer. Elizabeth doesn't know this. She thinks she knows everything about me. But when I was young, I was a passionate, creative writer and sort of a poet. That's how I would release myself. You know, whenever I was struggling in school or didn't want to go outside and deal with the nonsense of the neighborhood, I would write and write and write and write. So this workshop and celebrating you all is important to me as well, because I think it was my writing that sort of prepared me for so much of what I've had to do in my life as an adult. But you all come from all different backgrounds in different schools in different states across the country. But all of you students have one thing in common, and that is that same passion for poetry and writing that I had when I was young. And I understand that you all are a pretty talented bunch. I think that's why you got to come here, because you're pretty good at what you do. As poets, you all work wonders with the English language, arranging, rearranging words to tell stories and help paint pictures. That was something I loved to do with words, is just to paint a picture and make it real so that you felt like you were right there, to evoke the emotions of your readers. But in addition to being very talented, you all are something that what I think is even more important for being a poet, and that is you're brave. Robert Frost once wrote, "A poem begins as a lump in the throat." In writing poetry, you all put words into that kind of emotion. You give voice to your hopes, your dreams, your worries and your fears, and when you do that, when you share yourself that way and make yourself vulnerable like that, you're taking a risk, and that's brave. Not many people are willing to do that, to put themselves out there like that. And when you write poetry, you're not just expressing yourself, you're also connecting to people, and that's the key to everything we want to be and do as human beings, is our ability to connect to one another. Think about how you feel when you read a poem that really speaks to you, one that perfectly expresses what you're thinking and feeling. When you read that, you feel understood, right? I know I do. You feel less alone. I know I do. You realize despite all our differences, there are so many human experiences and emotions that we share. And poetry doesn't just show us how much we share. It also exposes us to wonderful new ideas and experiences. It helps us see the world in an entirely different way. As Rita Dove once wrote, what writing does is to reveal. A good poem can awaken our senses and help us notice things that we've never noticed before. It can take us to places we've never gone, to a mountaintop or a battlefield or a city halfway around the world. And I know that writing poetry is not easy. I know that sometimes you really got to work hard to make it happen. I know that it can be discouraging when you're struggling with writer's block and you can't find that word that is just right or get that line exactly the way you want it to be. I know I was talking to Malia last night, who was working on a paper, and it's her first draft. She said, "I hate first drafts. It's the toughest thing is the first draft." And I know that feeling. I know we all know that feeling of the first draft. But when you start to feel that kind of frustration, when you feel like you've been working on a poem forever, but it's just not coming together, I want you all to know that you're not alone. Rita Dove goes through as many as 50 or 60 drafts when she's writing a poem. I try to tell my kids that all the time. It is not the first draft. There's no such thing as a first draft. You write and you write and you write, And for Rita, she might take as long as 2 years to finish a poem. Is that true? Does it take you 2 years to finish a poem, Elizabeth? See there? So, even the best. So I want you all to keep at it. Keep taking those risks. Keep having the courage to share your work, which is so important. That was the best part of writing. It was reading it back to my mother, making them sit and listen to my work. And I also had to read it and perform it. So keep sharing, keep reading poetry, and learning from other poets. And even if you don't grow up to be a professional poet, I promise that what you learn through reading and writing poetry will stay with you throughout your life. It will spark your imagination and broaden your horizons and even help your performance in the classroom. And that's what Melody was talking about just a little while ago. That's why it is so critically important that we integrate the arts into schools. It is a must. It's critically important that we continue to encourage after-school programs and engage community partners to help young people like all of you develop your gifts and to fulfill your potential. This is not an option. This is a must. You know, for so many young people, this will be the air they breathe, the reason they keep going to do the right thing. That's what you'll all be doing today here with these brilliant poets and artists. This is a true gift to you all to be in this room with these people. They will share their own stories with you, give you tips and advice that are invaluable. So I hope that you take the fullest potential of your time here in the White House. I want you to ask lots of questions and listen carefully. Do not be afraid. Don't let the cameras or the lights intimidate you. We're just here. I just happen to be the first lady, but that's not a big deal. It's hard to say. Because these folks have a lot of wisdom to share, and I know that they are as excited as I am to be sharing it with you. And know that, as I always say, you got to keep passing it on. You got this experience to be here, right? So you are fortunate, you are blessed. So the question after this is, what are you going to do to pass it on? You know, what are you going to do to give this gift back? Because not everybody could fit in this room. If we could, we would have had it. It's small rooms. White House seems big, kind of small. So it's up to all of you to keep passing this on. So with that, I'm going to stop talking so that all of you can start learning. Thank you again for joining us at the White House. You're going to get to see the performance this evening. So we'll wave to you in the camera. So I hope you have a wonderful time today. I'm going to sit for the first session and hear a little bit, but we'll probably get up while you keep going. So with that, do I turn it over to you, Elizabeth? All right. It's on you. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam. How lucky are we to be with you? It's a joy. So I'm operating from here for now, and I'm going to tell you how this workshop with a lot packed into it is going to work. We've grouped together some extraordinary voices. I will introduce them briefly in small groups, some pairs, and a sextet, and then one person who'll be working alone, and we'll hear a few words from them about how they approach the writing of poetry. I may ask some questions, but mostly you'll have a chance to ask some questions. We're going to be moving fast because we're trying to do a lot in the time that we have allocated. So as you listen to these folks talk about their work, please start formulating any questions that you might have to ask them. Got to take off my glasses. And so we'll begin with our first two poets, Rita Dove and Billy Collins. They have in common that they are two former poets laureate of the United States. The person who holds that position is the most visible exemplar and ambassador of the art form, and they've thought in very different creative ways about how poetry might be brought to the people and the people brought to poetry. Many of our greatest poets have been asked to serve as poet laureate, and what's nice about that job in the United States is that you're not expected to write poems on state occasions on behalf of your country. Rather, you represent your country simply by doing the thing that you do best, the way that you do it. I will introduce in sequence Rita Dove and Billy Collins, and then they'll both come up and join us and talk in sequence. Rita Dove was the youngest person ever named Poet Laureate of the United States. She held the position from 1993 to 1995. She was educated in Ohio, Germany, and Iowa, and first began teaching in the English department of the University of Arizona in 1981, and then in 1989 moved to teach at the University of Virginia, where she is today. She published her first book of poems, a miraculous book, The Yellow House on the Corner, in 1980, followed by Museum, followed by Thomas and Beulah in 1987, which won the Pulitzer Prize. Her gorgeous, intelligent, meticulous poems have inspired countless poets who follow her, and I must say, including myself. She's written short stories, a novel, a play, collaborated with composer John Williams on a piece for a Steven Spielberg documentary called The Unfinished Journey, and her most recent book is Sonata Mulatica. Billy Collins was Poet Laureate of the United States in 2001. His poems, always witty, sometimes ironic, often hilarious, always wise, have made him one of our country's most popular poets. His collections include, this is among many, many, many books of poems, The Apple That Astonished Paris, The Art of Drowning, and Picnic Lightning. I particularly love those titles. He's distinguished himself through clear, accessible poetry that never sacrifices ambiguity and subtlety. Very hard to hold all of that aloft at the same time. And has spoken out against the writing of poetry strictly for an academic audience. As U.S. Poet Laureate, he created a poetry collection called Poetry 180, a project whose aim was to increase poetry's popularity among teenagers by exposing them to a meaningful contemporary poetry for each day of the school year. So please come to the stage, Rita Dove and Billy Collins.
Here we are, dear. I am going to start off. First of all, it is thrilling to see all of you here. The energy really is palpable in the room. Because you are people who know that language is important and that how you say something is perhaps 10 times, maybe 1,000 times more important than what the meaning you put behind it. But I'm going to talk fast. I have 5 minutes, and then we're going to do some questions. I was thinking about what happened when I was Poet Laureate, and I received so many letters from students your age, and they always began with, "I don't know much about poetry," or, you know, "Well, I'm not really an expert on poetry, but," and then after that little word "but" came some of the most incredible descriptions of how poetry had moved them, how what it meant to them, and how important it was to the world. One mother of 3 wrote me, she was despairing because her daughter wanted to be a poet and she didn't know how she was going to make a living. But she then said, "I understand now that poetry is making the language your own." And I've carried that with me ever since, because I think one of the most important things I can say to you today is that only you can tell the story that you experience and that you live. Only you have that story. And in terms of trying to find your voice in a certain way will find you. If you remain true to the experiences that you see, if you remain true to the idea that maybe your first draft expresses your heart, but it's not getting across to anyone else, and then you have to use your tools, which is language, which is silence, which is the way a word can sound ugly or prickly just by its very sound, to find the right word. If you can get into the joy of rewriting so that someone else can feel your heart and your story, then you've got a Made in the Shade. It's the most exhilarating feeling in the world, and I too hate those first drafts. They are, a mess. But to remember that once you get past that first draft, there's a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful sense of making it just right. You know, the very first book that I remember was a book, it didn't have very many words at all. It was called Harold, excuse me, Harold and the Purple Crayon. Oh. It was a fabulous book because there was this little boy who had a purple crayon. His mother put him to bed, and then he decided he wanted to take a walk, so he drew a window with his purple crayon, and he climbed out the window, and he drew his own path, and he, drew his own boat, and when he sailed across an ocean, and he ate 9 different kinds of pie. I remember that. In a way, that was my first, I think, meeting with metaphor, because that's really a symbol for the imagination, isn't it? I mean, you write, and you write on the wave of your own writing. It will lead you. And as you go through the revision process and things begin to click into place, you'll discover all of those people who are with you on that path. So to remember, first of all, you have your story to tell, your voice, be brave. As the First Lady said, it is a very scary enterprise, but it's an exhilarating one. And follow the purple path.
Well, thank you, Rita. I can do a lot of things in 5 minutes, but teaching a workshop is probably not one of them. I can make a bed in 5 minutes, but it's not a very well-made bed. But I wanted to talk a little bit about, I know there are a lot of adults here, but I want to talk mostly to the students here and just give them a little advice about my experience in writing. One of the phrases that you run into if you take a writing workshop or is finding your voice. And it's true enough that if one is lucky, someone said everyone's born with about 300 bad poems in them at birth, and the only way to get rid of them is just to write them out till you get to the good stuff. So there's always that period, and you shouldn't worry about whether you're good now. You're probably not that good, but you'll get better. There is hope. And it's true that finding your voice, you can get to a point as you're writing where you feel that you're writing like no one else. Seamus Heaney has his famous poem called Digging, and it's one of the earliest poems he wrote. And he said after he wrote that poem, he read it back, and he said, for better or worse, no one else could have written that poem. He knew that was his poem. Not that it was great, he wouldn't be that immodest, but there is that point you get to. But what I don't like about the expression finding your voice is that it's very mystifying, I think, in the minds of young people. It makes you feel, it made me feel when I first heard it, that your voice is tied up with your authenticity, that your voice lies deep within you at some root bottom of your soul, and that to find your voice, you need to fall into deep introspection. Like figuring out if you're one of the elect or not. You have to gaze deeply into yourself. And the frustration or the anxiety is that maybe you won't find anything there. And then you're on this terrible quest to nowhere. Let me reassure, which sometimes works out, but let me reassure you that it's not that mysterious. Your voice has an external source. It is not lying within you. It is lying in other people's poetry. It is lying on the shelves of the library. To find your voice, you need to read deeply. You need to look inside yourself, of course, for material, and because poetry is something that honors subjectivity. It honors your interiority. It honors what's inside. But to find a way to express that, you have to look outside yourself, read widely, read all the poetry you can get your hands on. And in your reading, you're searching for something. Not so much your voice, you're searching for poets that make you jealous. Professors of writing call this literary influence. It's jealousy. And it's with every art, whether you play the saxophone or do charcoal drawings. You're looking to get influenced by people who make you furiously jealous. So I say read widely, find poets that make you envious, and then copy them. Try to get like them. Say, you know, you read a great poem in a magazine somewhere, and you just can't stand the fact that you didn't write it. Well, what do? Well, you can't get white out and just put, you know, blank out the poet's name and write yours in. That's not fair. But you can say, okay, I didn't write that poem. Let me write a poem like that, that is sort of my version of that. And that's basically the way you grow. Okay, that's point one. The other point is, don't forget that poetry is play. Poetry is play, because we often take ourselves, of course we take ourselves seriously, but poetry is not only a place to take yourself more seriously than you take yourself in normal life. It's a place to have fun with language. It's a place to play. Kenneth Koch was asked, lovely poet, was asked, you know, what's the difference between prose and poetry? And he gave a kind of illustrative example. He said, here's prose. No dogs allowed on the beach. That's prose. Here's poetry. No dogs or logs allowed on the beach. No poodle, however trim. No dachshund unable to swim. Why is that poetry? Well, it's funny for one thing, but also it seems that the language is enjoying itself. The words seem to be aware of the words around them. And that self-consciousness seems to be a chorus or a plot designed to fill you with joy and pleasure. I think that's 5 minutes. I don't know, but we would love to hear some questions from you, and then we can extend this for maybe another 5 minutes or 2 minutes.
Thank you. So a question, yes, right here. Why don't you stand up, please? Oh, sure.
Keep wondering.
Yeah, I will. How do you find or approach the balance between the need to convey your own story and the need to convey your experience to someone else?
You know, I always think of Hemingway. He said that the first draft of his novel was entirely for him, and the second was a compromise, and the third was entirely for the audience. It was entirely for his readers. There's a point, I think, when you're writing, there is that interiority. You want to get that feeling out, that story out, but there's also a point where you want to reach out and touch somebody else and say, I want you to understand this. And it's not so much finding a balance as it is a trajectory. You know, there's a point where you will not be satisfied with just writing it for yourself, but you want someone else to hear it and understand it too. So you keep working on it, it'll tip.
Can I just answer that too? I think the difficulty in engaging, you know, a reader's intention is that basically readers don't care about you, because they don't care about. I mean, no stranger is really interested in your internal life, right? I mean, it's hard enough to get the people around you interested in your internal life. They're always hung up on themselves. What's up with that? So how their attention is insufficient. How do you get a reader? You need to pleasure the reader, and you do that through form. You do that through writing a poem in which the words are well chosen, in which there's shape to it, where there are signs of human intelligence. And in fact, to put it more bluntly, to get a reader interested in your poetry, you have to pretend something that's not true. You have to pretend. Your poem has to express this. Your poem has to express the fact that you're more interested in poetry than you are in yourself, which you are not. But the reader comes to you with an interest in poetry, not with an interest in you, granted. So if your poem conveys your interest in poetry, then that will lock in with the reader's interest in poetry, and then the reader will be interested in some fishing trip you took with your uncle or whatever you want to write about.
Another question right here.
Hi, you talked about finding your voice and imitating other poets and things like that. Did you stop doing that? At what point do you stop doing that? When do you know that you found your voice?
Well, after you find your voice, you realize there's only one person to imitate, and that's yourself. But you do it by combining different influences. I think the first part of it is you do slavish imitations, which are almost like travesties, you know. But gradually you come under the right influences, picking and choosing and being selective, and then maybe your voice is the combination of 6 or 8 other voices that you have managed to blend in such a way that no one can recognize the sources. So you can take, like, intimacy from Whitman. You can learn the dash from Emily Dickinson. I mean, you can pick a little bit from every writer and you combine them. And this allows you to be authentic. That's one of the paradoxes of the writing life, that the way to originality is through imitation.
You know, I'd also say that when you imitate, you can do parodies as well, which are sometimes very useful because then you understand how that particular poet used the irony or something like that. Then I think that what happens too is that you become impatient with the imitation. You say, well, I want to go somewhere else. You know, I don't want to stay in imitation. That's a little bit of your voice poking out, right? Saying, you know, I can do it different than that. And so, you know, a musician will practice their scales and they will practice all sorts of things. Why people think that writers get struck by lightning and suddenly write the perfect poem in one fell swoop, I don't know. So, you know, this idea of doing imitations or writing sonnets until they come out of your ears is part of your craft. Yeah.
One more quick question. Yes.
How do you both?
Here's your microphone.
How do you both teach play?
Play?
Mm-hmm.
I have a thing called the wild card, which I give to my students. It can come at any time during the semester, you know. It can take, they're all different, and they involve very strange things, like at the first sign of the moon tonight when it rises, go out into a field and look for something purple. And then they have to open envelopes, and then the next envelope will say, and now you must turn around and sit and write, you know, a haiku, and then go back inside. So I give them all the stuff that makes them so angry at me because they're like, especially, you know, I'll tell someone, you know, put on your heels and go out in the field. What do you mean go out in the field with my heels on? Because I want them to feel how uncomfortable that is. But in the end, what happens is that they say, I don't even care what I write anymore because I have to open another envelope, and they just play. They just say, I'm just going to let it out. Those wild cards are so much fun to write, and in the end, many of my students say it's the most fun they've ever had writing the poem. It's the idea of letting go of your ego, forgetting who you are, playing with that language and seeing what comes out of it that touches you instead of trying to impose something on the language.
Students will start to play once they get irreverent about poetry, once they stop taking it dead seriously. And the hope is that they'll stop taking themselves dead seriously, because the dead seriousness, the earnestness often overwhelms play. So I take poems like Byron's She Walks in Beauty Like the Night, and I just say, you know, substitute night for something. So she walks in beauty like a nutcracker, or she walks in beauty like a tangerine. And then, you know, and then suddenly everything's up for grabs, and you're into imaginative play, and that's what poetry really offers.
Thank you, Billy Collins and Rita Dove.